Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Peace Islands Institute New York event. Happy to have you with us today at our online event. We will be covering an important topic, 75 years since Auschwitz, lessons for today from the Holocaust, with Beth Gerson and Rabbi Kahn. Beth is currently a gallery educator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust here in New York City, in Manhattan, and Rabbi Kahn event. We will be covering an important topic, 75 years since Auschwitz. This Associate Rabbi, newly appointed Associate Rabbi at Congregation, and Rabbi Kahn here in New York, currently a gallery educator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, for joining us. Holocaust here in New York City, in Manhattan, and Rabbi I'd like to start off with Beth, if you may. Could you kindly introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us a little bit about your personal connection to today's topic? Thank you again.
Absolutely, and thank you. Thank you for your hospitality. I am a gallery educator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage here in New York. And my personal connection and my professional connection and my volunteer connection all converge. My doctorate, my Ph.D. is in literacy. And my focus has always been, my lifelong focus has always been looking at literacy through a sociocultural lens, knowing that whether we're speaking with children or adults, we all come with that, all of that experience that that speaks very strongly to our lives, to how we live our lives. I'm going to jump back from. Okay. I also am an adjunct professor at Fordham University. I work with psychology students as well as literacy students who are becoming school psychologists, who are becoming teachers. Some are teachers already. And so my experience as a literacy specialist looking through that lens matters greatly with that. Personal connection is I do have family who are lost in the Holocaust, and much of the research and writing that my husband and I now do together deal with his family experiences. He is a second generation survivor, and much of his family was lost in the Holocaust. And that converges with my experience at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. For the last 11, 12 years, we have traveled extensively studying the Holocaust and learning as much as we can possibly learn. I will add one more part of my personal connection, which is a very short anecdote, and it has to do with that sociocultural lens. When I was, many years ago, 1961, I was going to school in actually a township in Indiana where I was the only Jewish child. And it was spring of 1961. The Eichmann trials were underway, and we had a current events bulletin board. Children were bringing in articles about the Eichmann trials because it was current events. And it was the first time in many cases that the Holocaust was coming into people's living rooms, into the living room across America and across the world. And I had children coming up to me at that time, knowing I was Jewish, and saying, "I'm sorry." And it wasn't until years later that I really connected to that and what that meant. So I've brought that forward as well. And that's really where I am. My public school experience was 30 years in teaching literacy, an administrator in that same field, dealing with teachers, children, and it was always with a focus toward looking at each of us and our experiences through that multicultural, multilinguistic lens.
Thank you, Beth. And now, Rabbi Andy Kahn, if you could introduce us a little bit about more of your background and your connection to today's topic, please. Thank you and welcome.
Absolutely. Again. Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I'm glad to be able to have this platform and to speak a little bit about my experience and to hopefully reach out and even though we're not getting too much feedback from the audience, make a little bit of a connection and just so people know from the get-go, should you want to reach out at any point after this, I'm freely available. Emory has my contact information, and you can go to my synagogue's website, emmanuelnyc.org, to find out how to contact me too. I'm the associate rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Manhattan. I'm now beginning my third year at Temple Emmanuel, and this was my first job out of rabbinical school. I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, which is a far cry from Midtown Manhattan, and really to talk about my experience or my connection to the horrors of the Shoah, the Holocaust. I kind of have to go back a few generations for obvious reasons, but my grandparents, who are of Jewish descent, were born here. Their parents were immigrants, and their parents immigrated to America before Nazi Germany even existed, but they were already fleeing anti-Semitism. And branches of both families who did not immigrate were lost during the Holocaust. So it's a bit more of a long reach in my actual genealogy, but where it plays the biggest role really is in my upbringing and then in the work I do now. For my generation and the generation before me, the Holocaust loomed large in every aspect of Jewish life. I grew up with Holocaust survivors in my synagogue, teaching my religious school. A huge focus of what it means historically to be Jewish, according to my upbringing, has to do with remembering the Holocaust. The never again statement was always present in my education. And today, now, as a Jewish religious and spiritual leader, I always have to keep in mind the trauma that people are bringing to any Jewish event they are attending. So even folks who don't regularly attend synagogue, when they do, because of the way we have been brought up and educated, and because of the incredibly, I hesitate to say powerful, because often powerful sounds positive, but it has been a very powerful, like more so than almost anything else, impact on the Jewish community worldwide. Everyone brings the Holocaust with them to everything they do Jewishly. And so it always has to be, at least in part, what I'm thinking about when I'm educating, when I'm leading services, and especially when I'm leading services on during major holidays, because these are some people's only yearly events where they kind of exercise their Jewishness in a very tangible way. And so it is the yearly time they get to kind of confront that intergenerational trauma they bring. Sometimes first generation, sometimes second, and sometimes it's really just having a connection, being Jewish, even if you don't have direct descendants from the Holocaust, you are still impacted by it, because we collectively see ourselves as having been completely affected, whether or not we had ancestors that were directly impacted.
Thank you, Rabbi. just as a reminder to our audience, we will be taking questions from the chat box on our YouTube channel. And while you're there, of course, like this video and subscribe to our channel. But please provide your questions via the chat box to the right of your screen. Now, if I may, Beth, coming back to you, you've discussed a personal connection. Could you go a little bit more into your professional role now, and of course the important link and the current exhibition at the museum that you're at?
Absolutely. I want to go back, in order to do that, I want to go back just for a quick moment to what Andy said, that personal connection we do, I think, very strongly bring with us. Each of us is, while not identified by the Holocaust, certainly do own it in the way he described, and that's really, really important. Yeah, at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, there are, and I'm going to focus there primarily. There are several lessons there are several areas of focus that are always really important. As we go through with adults and with children, we focus on I in particular focus on each individual and each individual experience. If I'm with a group of children in particular, young people, we talk about the numbers. We talk about, in the current exhibition on Auschwitz, we talk about the fact that there were other people affected as well. While Hitler and the Nazis targeted the Jews as enemies, other people were affected also by the Nazi ideology, which was grounded in race. So we talk about the Roma. We talk about all of the groups who were affected. People who Hitler didn't consider pure German. And then when we talk about the Jews, we talk about the number, the great number, the 6 million. We talk about 1.5 million of them being children. Whether it's in this exhibition or the core exhibition that was in its place previously, I always put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the individual as well, because that's really, really important. I'll say to younger children particularly that 7th graders, 8th graders, these are such big numbers. Even when we talk about the Roman 21,000 that were murdered in Auschwitz, these are really big numbers. So I tried to break it down to the individual, because that's what's really meaningful. These were individual lives. We look at a red shoe in a case by itself against a background of thousands of red shoes from people who were murdered. But we talk about the red shoe, who wore this shoe, why was that important? And we connect it to other artifacts as we go through. Another area of tremendous focus, in particular at the museum, but I've tried to talk about, bring that through all of my work wherever I've been, is on stereotyping and propaganda and the dangers of that. It becomes very important. We talk about it, we look at the artifacts, because at the museum in particular, the goal is to let the artifacts speak, and we talk about the artifacts, and we talk about the history through the artifacts. Whether it's a map, whether it's a shoe, it all matters. Whether it's a segment of the fence from Auschwitz, we talk about it from that perspective. So those are two of the areas where we concentrate, the stereotyping, the propaganda being very important, and focusing on what can happen as a result, and bringing that forward. In my the connection to my work otherwise has been, again, as Andy mentioned, with recognizing that so many individuals, families that we encounter, that we work with, have in some way had a relationship to the Holocaust, and it affects them strongly.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Beth. I've actually visited the exhibition. It's very difficult. I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., but this exhibit, of course, is very particular to Auschwitz. It's something I would recommend all Americans, really all people to visit. It is difficult, so you need to be prepared for that. But these are very important stories that need to be highlighted to understand our past, and hopefully to prevent these types of very serious situations being relived. And Andy, if I may, similarly, you've spoken about your personal connection. What is your current professional role in regards to the Holocaust?
Yeah, I spoke about it a little bit, but I'd like to get a little bit more specific as well. There are three aspects of what of the takeaway from the Holocaust I think are most impactful, and it's theodicy, mythopoeticism, and otherness. And these are all the things that are playing into my head when I'm trying to hold the Holocaust as part of what I'm doing as a rabbi. So when I say theodicy, I mean the ultimate question of if we are a people that has a special connection to God, where was God when this happened? As you said at the very beginning, Emery, we've got a limited amount of time here, so I can't actually begin to even try to answer that question. But the reality is that's always present when anyone ever talks about the Holocaust. It's just implied in the mere existence of the event. And so the generation immediately after the Holocaust, or even those that lived through it, there are a number of theologians that tried to answer it. And there were a number of different approaches by those theologians. And I try to balance those because I know each one of those theologians kind of carries, people carry within them in one way or another. And so I try to answer, one of the primary ways of answering it is that, like, actually, we don't need to care about God anymore. And what we need to do is not give Hitler a posthumous victory, which is a phrase that is used quite often. It's used for various ends. It is my least favorite of these theologies because it still puts the power in the hands of the Nazis to define the bounds of what it means to be Jewish. But a lot of people carry that with them. So I try to remember that the way that I understand that answer is that we're still living with a certain amount of fear of the Jewish people ceasing to exist. And the Holocaust is the kind of metonymic historical act that represents that fear as being possibly tangible. And so we always have to grapple with that. The people are, in many ways, our people are still living through it because that fear is still present. Another one that I really do tend to lean towards is Viktor Frankl. His kind of most famous book is Man's Search for Meaning. He was a Holocaust survivor. He made it through the death camps. He was a psychiatrist, and he came out with a belief that it is up to us to define the bounds of our meaning, and that God is present when we do that. And I find that a very compelling takeaway. His writing is unbelievable. It's very clear and very impactful. So if you want to learn more about kind of my favorite theological approach, look up Viktor Frankl. His books are freely available. I also said mythology. So there is a conflict when we deal with contemporary historical events as having theological impacts, because most of the time the way that we derive theology is from mythological texts. Even if those mythological texts have rooting in an actual history, like some of the Bible, they're still mythological texts. The Holocaust is not a mythological text, at least not yet. Yitz Greenberg, who's a very famous still living rabbi, has written about the ways in which things pass into the realm of mythology, and how long that takes. And mythology does not mean like not true. It means that in some ways, history becomes literature, and we start looking at it for its metaphorical content, as opposed to looking at it as a completely literal, a literal event. We're able to do both at the same time. And there's still quite an argument as to whether the Holocaust can be looked at in that way yet or not. And this gets embodied in one very particularly interesting way, in that there's a day on the Jewish calendar called Tisha B'Av. It's happening at the end of July, that originally was about mourning the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in both 586 BC and 70 CE. But over time, it came to be the holiday repository for every tragedy that ever befell the Jewish people. And it was just a day of remembrance for tragedies. So included in there are the Spanish Revolution, or not Revolution, excuse me, Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition, pogroms that occurred throughout Poland, things of that nature. And one of the questions that has arisen is whether the Holocaust should be remembered on that day as well, because we also have a holiday to specifically remember the Holocaust. And one of the things that is baked into that question is whether we can mythologize it enough to include it on Tisha B'Av because it didn't happen on Tisha B'Av, or we still need a special day because it's still only historical. So we are standing in this midpoint right now. And I think probably the generation after me will be able to work on it a little more clearly in that regard. For one very tragic reason, which is my generation, and even the kids coming up right now have still met Holocaust survivors. They're going to be the last generation to do so. And so once no one is living anymore that actually experienced it, then maybe we can start trying to figure out more of a mythopoetic way of understanding it. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going over my time just a little bit. So I want to say one more thing, and I'll talk about it more later, which is the thing that has the Holocaust has most deeply ingrained in us is our otherness and our fear of our own otherness in relation to our neighbors. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but it has led many Jews to feel as though we can never be safe if we are surrounded by non-Jewish people, which is something that I work actively to deprogram, but I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Thank you, Andy. Just a reminder again to our audience, we're getting questions. So if you have a question for our speakers today, please type them into the YouTube chat box to the right. And again, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. And of course, we're also present on Facebook and Twitter. So please take time to visit those as well. So in terms of lessons, what do you tend to focus on, Beth?
Excuse me. I mentioned part of that earlier, but I also wanted to, and particularly in light of what Andy was talking about, I also want to mention too, we look at the propaganda, we look at the dangers of propaganda, we look at the ideology, the very baseless racial science, and two of the other areas where we concentrate and are very clearly areas of focus in the exhibition are resiliency. And that's a really big deal. And I think that speaks very strongly to I think it speaks strongly to some of the points Andy was making. There was it's actually the latest addition to the Auschwitz exhibition. There is a shofar that was actually blown in Monowitz. There are many many people talk about stories of when there were shofarim blown, where the shofar is blown on Rosh Hashanah, and where they have been blown. This is the one shofar, and it's in the exhibition now, that was blown in Monowitz, which is the Auschwitz III. It was then given to
Beth, I'm sorry to stop you. Can you explain what a shofar is? Because maybe people may not know.
I'm so sorry. It's a ram's horn, and it is blown on Rosh Hashanah. It is a call that it is a ram's horn. It was actually this year, late summer, where a resident here in New York gave to the museum for use in the exhibition the ram's horn, the shofar, that was given to her father when he went on the death march out of Auschwitz. And it was given to him by a prisoner, another, who didn't think he would make it. It's now in the museum. It was blown this year, and it was amazing. That was an act of resiliency, both blowing it and taking it out. In Auschwitz, there was an uprising. There were several prisoners who worked in the munitions factory next door, and they were smuggling in munitions. Did they think any more than the partisans, the young people who were partisans in the ghettos, did they think they were going to win? Were they going to beat Hitler? No, but it was resiliency. There is another artifact. It's called the Heart of Auschwitz. It is a tiny little book comprised of little pieces of paper hooked together. A young woman was going to celebrate her 20th birthday. She was living in one of the barracks, and her friends in the barracks said, "We will celebrate your birthday." And they wrote little messages. It was resiliency. Another woman took shreds and made a necklace with a Star of David on the necklace. Why did she do that? Somebody else, and these are all exhibited in that exhibition, and it's in a room having to do with resiliency. There's a little silver comb that somebody carved, one of the prisoners carved. She didn't have any hair, and we had that conversation. Why did she do it? It was hope for tomorrow. It was faith. So that's one area that's real, that we haven't talked about yet, but really important, that resiliency. The other area, and it speaks directly to the lessons. Yes, we want kids to know about and adults. We want them to understand the evils. We want them to understand what can happen. We also want them to know that there were those who helped. And that's really important. Whether it was Oskar Schindler, or whether it was something really small, whether it was the family who in Slovakia, who sheltered a Jewish family when the Nazis invaded Slovakia. Small or enormous, it's all enormous. So another one I'll mention is Irina Sendler, who, with the help of ambulance drivers and so on, helped to save over 2,000 children from the Warsaw Ghetto. So whether big or small, there was no small act of doing the moral thing, doing what was right. And those are some of the big lessons.
Thank you, Beth. And Andy, for you, what are the lessons to focus on?
So first of all, thank you, Beth. I really appreciate you setting those up, because I think that's really helpful to me in framing what I would like to say the most important lessons are. One of the things that's very difficult to talk about within Jewishness is the concept of chosenness. It gets used a lot in negative ways, both by Jewish people and by non-Jewish people. And it can be used in positive ways by both as well. It can reflect a sense of supremacy, or it can reflect a sense of having a particular mission in the world. Those things, obviously, we do not want to reflect on ourselves as having some kind of supremacy. And one of the things that was used in the Holocaust to single out Jews was the idea of Jewish chosenness. It was part of the conspiracy theories that the Nazis put together to defame Jews and to make it look like Jews were attempting to control the world. But it is a real part of Jewish text, Jewish prayer, and Jewish self-conception. So educating people on what chosenness actually means, which is to say that we have a particular relationship with the divine that is channeled through a particular textual tradition, which is the Torah. And that is what being chosen means, chosen for this particular teaching. That doesn't mean that other people aren't chosen for other particular teachings that are just as important and just as impactful. So making sure to clearly frame things in that way when we talk about chosenness, so that Jews don't internalize anti-Semitic notions themselves, and that non-Jews don't see the idea of chosenness as something to fear Jews about or dislike Jews for. And part and parcel of this is what it means to be a part of society. So for many, many, many generations, Jews were not allowed to be full parts of the societies they dwelled in, whether it was throughout the European world or the Middle Eastern world, and the contexts were very different, and the experiences were very different, but still Jews were not part of society. And there was a moment during the beginning of the modern era when, particularly in Germany, Jews were emancipated, which meant technically Jews had all of the rights of non-Jewish citizens of Germany. And this happened just about 100 years before the Holocaust. So by the time the Nazis took power, many Jews had fully believed that they were fully normalized German citizens. Many still had a sense that they weren't, that like they still kind of traveled in primarily Jewish circles socially, and their business networks were still primarily Jewish, but technically by the law, they were supposed to be completely equal. And then that got taken away. And that betrayal is something that I think particularly Jews in America are fearful of today, because we do have a sense of complete equality here. And maybe even, not maybe, certainly even white Jews have a sense of privilege in America that people of color do not have and Jews of color do not have. But when most people in America think of Jews, they think of white Jews. So we are part of this society, but in some ways, even within our culture, feel like we can never be fully part of it. And there's good reason. Anti-Semitism still exists very, very strongly. I grew up with tons of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to go into all the examples, but it wasn't just covert. It was overt. It was people being openly anti-Semitic and threatening my family and defacing my synagogue and things of that nature. So there is also a good reason to be fearful. But the way that I choose to look at the lesson we can take away from that fear is that because in particular, this country being America has been so good to us, even though anti-Semitism still exists, it has been very good to us. It is on us as Jews, and not all Jews have found this level of privilege, but the Jews that have, to make sure that the oppression that was done to us in the past is not done to others here. And that's the way to make sure that we are actually a part of our societies. And that's a lesson that is particularly poignant at this very moment in our society's history, that our culture, our people, our communities need to be showing up to stand with those communities, particularly the Black community that is most under fire by the state right now. And I am, and many of us are showing up to stand in solidarity. And that, to me, is the biggest lesson to take away from the experience of the Holocaust, because never again doesn't just mean never again for us. It means never again for anyone.
Thank you, Andy. Again, I'm sending links to our chat box. If you're there, you can see them. Please subscribe to our event newsletters. And again, we're still taking questions, so you're more than welcome to ask our speakers today. Now, Beth, what can Jews and members of the broader community do to help today?
Broad community, generally speaking?
Yes, well, Jews specifically, and then non-Jews in the broader community.
Okay. I think, again, referring directly back to what Andy said at the conclusion of his remarks, when Elie Wiesel, and I think this speaks directly to what you're asking, Elie Wiesel said, and this wasn't recent, but it applies so very strongly today, when human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, whenever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must at that moment be the center of the universe. What that means, as far as I'm concerned, is we must be upstanders. When we see wrong, we must address it. We must, people speak about our better angels. The better angels must always be allowed to step forward. As Nelson Mandela has said, no one is born hating another person. If we can learn to hate, we can learn to love. And part of that is understanding what propaganda and stereotyping are and pushing back. And again, Andy spoke very directly to anti-Semitism, and it can be so incredibly dangerous. And stereotyping is part of that. And that's a place where we all can help. We have to understand our own biases. We have to understand that stereotyping is just so incredibly wrong. And some of that seems to be almost automatic, almost reflexive. And we have to learn to push back against that. Both if we find ourselves falling into that or somebody else, whether it's a child or an adult, there are ways of doing it, of addressing it. Part of that is related to scapegoating or blaming others. That's what happened in Germany. The Jews, there was the anti-Semitism provided a foundation that grounded some of what the Nazis were able to do. Jews became the enemy. They were blamed for what happened during World War I. The Jews responded to that. The Jewish population in Germany, who felt so much part of Germany, pushed back. And they, in fact, put together a book. They formalized, these are the people that fought for the fatherland during World War I, but it didn't make a difference. And the examples go on and on and on. So it's the dangers of anti-Semitism, of stereotyping, of blaming others for misfortune. It has to be addressed head on. And the other part is teaching from a perspective of love, from a perspective of looking at others as they are, not stereotyping. And that's basically how I believe we push back. My husband and I are now taking an online course with Robert Jan van Pelt, who is the chief curator of the exhibition at the museum. And he was asked that very question, and he talked about truth and looking at truth and believing it. So those are some of the ways that we can push back, that we can address what can happen otherwise.
Thank you. And similarly, Rabbi Andy, what can Jews do today? What can the broader community, non-Jews, to help in the fight against genocide? And we've got questions. Actually, let me ask a question that we've got, maybe because it kind of fits to that. And Beth, by all means, you can come in on this later as well. How do we implement the important concept of never again? We've seen Bosnia, Rwanda, and many other genocides. Most recently, we saw the horrific scenes from Myanmar and the persecution, genocide of the Rohingya Muslims. What can be done? What can be done by individuals and organizations at a practical level? So maybe you can incorporate this into your answer as well. This is a question from the audience. Thank you, Andy.
So I'm going to start elsewhere and get there. Let me put it that way. One of the things that I think is most important is to keep an honest ear open for conspiracy theories in general. Anytime a complex historical, political event is occurring, and some down to something simple, like one group is doing it, not true. It is always going to be something significant, complex. Group is particularly an identifiable ethnic group or religious group. It's not true. Again, speaking to what Beth just said, you can't stereotype entire groups into being responsible for the actions of one or two or less people involved in something going on. And that's what ends up happening. So at your dinner tables, at the bar, or probably not the bar, but at the coffee shop maybe, when you hear these things being passed around that this X group did X, delve into it. Ask the person that's sharing it, why do you think that? What are your sources? And if they don't really have one, or they do, look into it. See what that source is and see what other sources say as well. It's in the days of the internet, it's not that hard to do. The key is finding sources that are actually trustworthy, because there's a lot of information to sort through. So learning how to find trustworthy sources is really important. And what we can do about ongoing genocides, I mean, being in the international, in the globalist world right now, where we're all so interconnected, it's easier to see them happening. They've always been happening. What we can do here is really fight what's happening here. That's the most effective way to do it, because in many ways, depending upon your definition of genocide, what has been going on and what continues to go on by the way our country oppresses the Black community is a form of genocide. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that sometimes what we think of genocide being, because the Holocaust has come to represent genocide, which is this overt, like almost factorified form of murder being the only thing that's genocide, is not true. Like there was a point when Nazi Germany was Nazi Germany and the Holocaust was not yet happening. And there were steps along the way, and getting in and stopping it before it reaches the next step is what you can do to help. And that this is true for also the way our country has been treating immigrants at the border. contacting your local representatives, organizing your communities to contact representatives together, standing with those communities who are being targeted, reaching out and telling them that you are willing to do what it takes to impact change, and then educating yourself without asking those communities to educate you about what it is to be oppressed in that way, so that you can figure out how you can help in your local community is the best thing to do. When it comes to the international community, I mean, I'm as helpless as anyone else. We can talk to our legislators. We can work with organizations that already exist with to impact the way that the UN deals with these things. But as we all know, the UN doesn't have the greatest track record of ending them either. Yeah, I'm as baffled as anyone else how to deal with that on an international level.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Beth, if I may, on top of that question, we've got another question from our participants. I'll just read a comment, and there's a question in the end, and it links to the concept of never again. Our NGO would very much like to partner on genocide prevention relating to current systematic persecutions impacting the Rohingya in Burma, the Uyghur in China, and other groups. Appreciate the museum's program on Rwanda a few years ago, raising awareness in the diverse Muslim community is also important, of course. How can we strengthen the genocide prevention movement when so many countries continue to play the nationalistic card and scapegoat minorities around the world?
Wow. That's a big question. That is such a big question. When, as I was listening, I'm going to jump back for a second, and I'm going to try to come in through a different door, I think. As I was listening to Andy, I was thinking on a very local and interpersonal level. And I think that's a first step. What I mean by that is this. We can never fully understand somebody else's experience. Okay, I saw that as I worked with young people, really young people, when I was in the school system. I had to try to understand. I never walked in their shoes. Many of them came from countries where there was civil unrest. I had not walked in their shoes, but I needed to do my best and later make sure that the teachers who worked under me and my students later at Fordham understood that they needed to do what they needed to do, whatever that was, to try to understand the children they were working with. You have to understand the other person, the person you're speaking with, the person you're communicating with. You have to try to understand their experience. And I think that's a big first step. Part of that so that's one thing. There are two other anecdotes that come immediately to mind, and hopefully they will help. Actually, it's one and the same. It's understanding that in many respects, even though our experiences are different, in many respects, there are similarities, and we can understand each other. The first was in and these are really fast, in one of my graduate classes. This was several years ago. There were two young women. They came in, they took their seats. I always felt I needed to start class immediately at 10 minutes to 5 because that's what the syllabus said. That day they came in. One of them had apparently, she was observant. She was Jewish. I didn't know that before, though I listened to the conversation. She came into class and she had her head covered. I later realized that she had her head covered. She was actually wearing a wig and she was also wearing a scarf. And she sat down next to a young woman who was wearing a hijab, and they started talking. Well, the clock said it was 10 to 5, but I was watching the class listen to their conversation, and I started listening to their conversation because that was much, much more important. They were talking about the the reason their head was covered, each of them, in her own respective faith, Muslim and Jewish. And my hope was that the other students who were listening intently, as was I at that point, took away a really important message. And we did talk about that later. The other experience, I'll go to children. When I was I work with the Interfaith Living Museum at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And in that, we have Jewish children and Muslim children coming with their schools, and they participate in it's a season-long project, actually, it's yearly. And those children at the end were most interested in hearing about they were there for the project, but they liked talking to one another about their experiences. So again, the takeaway is to learning about the other person. I think that that what we need to do, if we're talking on a broader level, what that means is it's not enough to only understand our own, but to understand, yes, internationally as well. And we don't always do a good enough job there. When it comes to what is happening here in America, we seem to be doing a better job in that, but we certainly can extend that. It doesn't fully answer the question, but I think it goes in that direction.
I'd like to jump in on that, actually, if
Thank
possible.
you. Yes, I was going to say, Andy, did you have any comments that you
Yeah.
wanted to add to that? Please.
As you were talking, Beth, a whole bunch of ideas came up, so I appreciate what you shared. And to me, as I said before, the best thing you can do is get involved on the ground in your community. But if you do wish to impact global conflicts and to fight global genocide, I think that there is a tendency, especially amongst Americans, to think that we know how to go somewhere and fix things. That like we have the capacity to fix stuff because we're Americans and we're the greatest nation on earth, or something to that effect. And my sincere belief is that the people there that are fighting it probably know better how to fix it than we do. So finding out who on the ground in these communities is doing the good work and is able to actually help their own community and make impacts on the ground there, and then giving them support from here and giving them exposure here, so that all of the wealth here can travel to the people that need it most in order to impact change on the ground in their communities. It's probably the best way to do it. It seems like the folks that are actually living on the ground in these places have the best sense of what will impact the best change. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Andy and Beth. We've got another question that links a little bit to what Andy said. Are we able to juxtapose the Holocaust and what America is going through in regards to the treatment of African Americans? Either of you would like to comment on that? Beth or Andy, would like to?
Yeah. If I may.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm going to actually go back to Elie Wiesel's quote, that whatever is happening to a group, whenever I think the dignity is a very big deal. Whenever the dignity or the lives of others are threatened, that group at that moment becomes the center of, becomes the center of the universe. And I think in the what's going on today in the demonstrations, in people gathering, is all about that. While it's not strictly young people, there are incredible numbers of young people, and they're not sleeping. They're watching, and they're out there, and they're being supported by many of us who are not young, but but they're out there and they recognize it as a very strong need, that change is needed. And what I believe what they are saying, when I watch this, I think of what Elie Wiesel said so many years ago, that whatever group is being threatened at that moment, their dignity and their very lives and their way of life, in some cases, they become the center of the universe. And I think that's what, to a large extent, we're seeing in front of us today.
Yeah,
and Andy, did you want to comment on that as well, please?
I would very much like to. And it goes back to a little bit of what I said before, which was there was a point in Nazi Germany when the Holocaust was not yet happening.
Right.
And right now, what we are seeing is the levying of fascist forces and fascist ideology targeting particularly the Black community, and also those standing in support with them. I think that there is an attempt to begin the push towards legislation that would allow for further violence from the government upon its citizenry, particularly targeting the Black community. I think that's what the idea of labeling quote unquote Antifa as a terrorist group really is about, because there is no group that is Antifa. So it would just be whoever the government decided fell within that group, they could then treat as basically a foreign national, and they would lose all of their rights. So I believe that's what that is. I believe that's what the desire to use the military on our own home soil is as well. I think it is an attempt at escalating towards something that could become like the Holocaust. And that makes it all the more incumbent upon us to make sure that does not happen. Speaking a little bit more about the African-American experience in this country, I actually don't think it's quite comparable, because the incredible trauma of it's hard to put into words, of the fact that slavery, kidnapping people from their homelands, bringing them here, erasing their pasts, erasing their backgrounds, making them into property, is the foundation of this conflict, makes it not quite comparable to the Holocaust, because that wasn't quite what Jews experienced in Germany. And then to double up on that with the movement towards Jim Crow, and then the civil rights movement that did not enact the promises that were given, is what has led to today. So the long hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years trajectory of the way in which African Americans have been oppressed throughout America's history, and which is actually foundational. I mean, it's in the Constitution. It's how our country was built. So it's not quite comparable. But I think that the fact that everyone living on American soil and benefiting from the current state of America is actively benefiting from those people's ancestors having been enslaved, means it's on us to make sure that this does not continue to progress, and that we actually move towards something like truth and reconciliation and reparations. Because that's the only way to really bring about justice in this country.
Thank you. Yes, Beth.
I'm so sorry. I just wanted to add quickly that, and I think to underscore the importance of knowing that each experience is unique.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Absolutely.
each experience is unique, but some of those underlying pieces are so very important. Whether it's, as Andy pointed out, conspiracy theories, or whether it's the propaganda, whether it's the stereotyping, whether it's the scapegoating, those are some of the similarities. So it's that underlying piece. In some cases, it's that sense of hate. There's so much there, but each experience is unique and unto itself.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Thank you, Andy. Just got a comment and maybe a final question before we wrap up. I want to thank our participants. There's various links in our chat box. Please do subscribe to our channel and obviously follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and you can of course get our newsletter emails via the links we've supplied in the YouTube chat box. Now we've got a comment here. In many countries, people don't know the exact meaning of Zionism. When Muslims hear Zionism, the reaction is exactly the same when Jews hear jihad. This is two-way ignorance. Both sides should do more work. Is a comment we've received. You can comment on this, but I'll ask this question as well. How many Nazi criminals were there, and how many were brought to justice?
I'm happy to answer I don't know. I certainly answered the second, so I'm not even going to try. That's something I would have to know. Maybe you could Google it. But the answer to the first question is that I think that something like, so for instance, through the very little education I have about Islam, I know that jihad has a multitudinous meanings. That at times it has meant literal war. Often it means spiritual with oneself. It can mean any number of things depending upon the context in which it's used. Zionism too is a squishy term. It can mean so many different things to so many different people, and to the point that I try not to use it as a word without defining clearly what I mean by it. And depending upon the context, I might mean different things. The way that it most often gets defined is that is the belief that Jews have a right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. That is the usual way I see people define it. Now, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but I just want to point out that that definition does not provide for any tangible kind of plan for how that can and should be done. And that's what makes it such a squishy word, and people go all kinds of directions with it. So there, I should probably just stop talking about it, but I think the key is that at its basic level, it's just about the belief in the right to Jewish self-determination in our ancestral homeland. And it has been used to legitimate things that I certainly don't agree with. And I do believe that there are ways that Jews can have self-determination in our ancestral homeland without impinging upon the self-determination of the Palestinian people that also exist there.
Beth, did you want to comment on that?
I actually, I listened carefully to Andy's definition, and I actually was focused on the number of Nazi criminals.
Yes, please.
Yeah, that, and thank you, Andy. I'm not sure that there's that total number, and I'm not even sure that it's a known number. This is, excuse me, as I say at the museum, to whether it's young people or adults. This is the question bears research. There are so many that you know, from guards in the various camps to the brown shirts who rounded people up, to those who like I started my comments talking about Adolf Eichmann, whose trial brought the Holocaust into many homes, you know, through television. The well-known, we know what's happened to them in most cases, and not all. But it's a question that bears, I think, that I know bears research, because there have been so many. And then we talk about all those who have been complicit and so on along the way. The list is long. And I'm not sure how many, and this is something that would be readily available. How many of those who are best known, were they all hunted? Were they all found? That would be a no. They had not all been found. And there are people who are still very much looking, who are working very hard at that. You know, even today, we have learned over the years a great deal about organizations who did. There were so many who did help, but there were others who also helped criminals escape. So, you know, go to safer places. But it bears research.
Okay, thank you both to Andy and Beth. And let me finish on a comment that somebody left. I think we need to have greater solidarity around anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism, is what one of our participants left. So I think this is a big aiming to that. Thank you very much to Beth. Thank you very much, Rabbi Andy. We appreciate your words today, a very difficult topic. And just a reminder to our participants and those watching this video, I would highly recommend you visit the Museum of Jewish Heritage for the Auschwitz exhibition. Beth, can you let us know when is that exhibition here till here in New York till?
I believe the date has been changing. It should be posted on the website. It has certainly been extended at least to the end of the year. But they will be posting. They will also be posting the opening, and they are doing a great deal right now with virtual programming as well.
Okay.
And, you know, that is a wonderful way to also listen to the speakers and see the artifacts and so on.
Yes. Again, I visited the exhibition. It is difficult, but I highly recommend it. We went in a group of, with a group of Jews and Muslims, so that added an extra dimension of engagement between the participants on that day. So for those people that are interested, again, visit the website of the Museum of Jewish Heritage here in Manhattan, in New York City. Again, thank you to Beth Gerson and to Rabbi Andy Kahn. If you do have any questions, by all means, we're happy to forward them on to Beth and Andy. Please email us at our through our email. And for those that are visiting us for the first time, find out more about Peace Islands Institute New York at our website, peaceislandsny.org. Again, thank you for all our participants on YouTube, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.